OUTRAGE. Written in the early 1990s for the Commodore 64 by Austrian developer Bernd Buchegger, member of Cosmos Designs. OUTRAGE was meant to be the Hawkeye killer, Hawkeye being a well-respected game made by the Boys Without Brains and published by Thalamus in 1988. OUTRAGE was Bernd's first and, so far, only game. It took from 1990 to 2020 to get the game published. Yeah, that's the 30 years that you may have heard about, and its story is carefully documented and well known. Or is it? OUTRAGE's history can easily be found and has been repeated on many websites and in plenty of magazines. It's easy to get an idea of how things went down, but sometimes when history is recounted, certain things receive a little less attention than perhaps they should. I felt it was time to revisit the history of OUTRAGE and look at it from a slightly different point of view, which is why I went around and asked a few people involved about their experiences. Well, let's run down the history of OUTRAGE very quickly. After becoming a member of Cosmos Designs, Bernd starts building a run-and-gun game in the style of Hawkeye during the weekends while he is attending a boarding school. He starts in 1990 and 2 years later an alpha version of OUTRAGE is done. In July of 1993, C64 magazine publishes a Böder-organized programming competition and Bernd enters. The prize for the 3 winners is a chance at a publishing deal and a trip to the south of France, including a visit to a Böder disc factory. Sadly though, in December of that same year, Böder pulls out and the 3 winners get no prize at all. Disappointment and anger ensue for poor Bernd. Disillusioned with the process, Bernd chucks the game in a drawer and forgets about it, until somebody converts Bernd's old discs to a PC-compatible format. Screenshots go up on the Games That Weren't website, and in 2010 Protovision say that they want to publish the game. Many attempts to finish the game fail until Cytronic's David Simmons from the demo and cracking group Onslaught saves the day in 2018, and the game is finished in 2020 and sold in Protovision's and Cytronic's online shops. The game is very well received, gets fantastic reviews, and Bernd looks a lot happier than he did back in 1993. When you order the game, you actually get a copy of that picture. This is a wonderful story, but it's really just a version of history. Let me take you back in time for an alternate look at things. If we want to better understand the history of OUTRAGE, we have to start at that competition. All I know about the Böder competition is that it was posted in C64's July issue of 1993, and 3 winners were presented in December of that same year. OUTRAGE was one of these 3 winners. The other winners being Cosmox by Hannes Sommer, Bernd's buddy from Cosmos Designs, and Genlock, another Hawkeye clone wannabe by Michael Stralecki from Example. I know absolutely nothing about the rest of the competition. The December 1993 issue of C64 said that there were many teams that entered, but not how many, who they were, or what their entries were. Cosmox is a puzzle game starring the Sommer brothers' Fred character who has to stomp stacks of discs into the same height before a timer runs out. It's a clever little game which looks to be well made. It's got everything from high score table, music, sound effects, and the puzzle element that makes you want to have another go. No question how Cosmox was among the winners. To be honest, it looks like a game that was already made to be published but just happened to be entered into the competition. Genlock is a side-scrolling run-and-gun game where you shoot everything that moves, collect eggs, and kill a dragon. It's a little monotonous and the difficulty level is so high that it makes the game unplayable. Without trainers, I couldn't survive for 5 minutes, and with trainers, I couldn't get off the first level. Pulling the joystick down doesn't mean duck, but jump down, even when there's no platform there, so you die. A lot. It's a bit rough and far from being perfect, but it runs. OUTRAGE clearly would have been more playable and more fun than Genlock, if only it had been finished, which it really wasn't. While OUTRAGE was among these 3 winners, it stands out in 2 ways. After Böder pulled out of the competition in December of 1993, both Cosmox and Genlock were published by the end of 1994. Cosmox by CP Verlag, the magazine publisher, and Genlock by Magna Media. Outrage was the only game not published. According to Bent, he was just too late and other priorities took precedence over finishing the game. The fact that Cosmox and Genlock were published shouldn't have come as a great surprise, because the original Zephyr's Extra July issue mentions publishing deals being offered to those that wouldn't win. And Hannes and Bernd being good friends, surely the timing wouldn't have been an issue. Hannes would have surely have told Bernd about how he managed a publishing deal for Cosmox. It is clear now that getting Outrage ready for publication would have taken too much time. Outrage was too far from being ready. The other way in which Outrage is different from the other winners is this. We know now that Outrage was not finished. The game would still crash and there were visual bugs, yet it managed to grab a place among the winners. It's very plausible that the arbitration would condone a few bugs for the competition, but for publication, surely any bugs would have to be eradicated. And that, as we will see in a minute, was quite a bit of work still. With other obligations on the horizon and the C64 losing popularity, perhaps the task just seemed too big to Bent and Cosmos Designs. So, 3 winners, 1 puzzle game, and 2 Hawkeye clones, one of which is unfinished and remains unpublished. But it wouldn't stay that way. Of course, Hawkeye wasn't part of the Böder competition, but it is the game both Genlock and Outrage sought to beat. So I feel like we should also take a quick peek at Hawkeye. Hawkeye was made by the Dutch group Boys Without Brains and published by Thalamus in 1988. It's a tough game to improve upon. It was made by 4 people instead of just 1, and it has a look and feel of a studio game. Loads of sound effects, good music, parallax scrolling background, well-made enemies. You can just tell that this game went through loads of iterations before it was called done. Who knows how much work it was to make Hawkeye. I asked one of the Boys Without Brains whether they felt if Outrage was the actual Hawkeye killer. Laurens van der Donk, one of the original boys, did have a look at Outrage, but he said that he'd been out of the retro scene for far too long to be able to give it a fair judgment. He felt that the game reviewers would probably do a better job. Outrage obviously needed some work before it was ready for publication. Part of that work was adding a loading screen, some extra music. There was only 1 single tune in the competition-winning version. Manual, packaging, loading and compression, an NTSC fix, that sort of thing. The sort of peripherals that we've come to expect from a modern game when it's published. If the official history doesn't tell us much about the state the game was in before it was finished, David Simmons, also known as Jazz Cat from Onslaught, gave us a hint in the disc magazine Vandalism, issue number 71. Quote, "No source code, many bugs that included fatal crashes, bosses not displayed correctly, raster flicker hell, and a lot more." Unquote. After it was decided that Outrage needed to be published, it first had to be finished, and David Simmons was the guy to take on the task of organizing it. Any complete history of Outrage should include the name David Simmons. He was the one who helped Cosmos Designs complete their memorial website by providing game originals they were missing. He had already been in touch with Bernd when he was working on Frank Gasking's Games That Weren't website. Some years later, when Protovision bought the 2-year rights to publish Outrage, David took on the task of managing Outrage to completion, a task he underestimated at the time. From when David got involved with the project, there were several attempts to get the project off the ground. First on the to-do list was determining whether it could be done at all. Because as David states, the game was in bad shape. There was no source code or documentation, and the game existed in several versions, each with levels in different stages of development. Although this made the job more difficult, it wasn't impossible. A team analyzed and documented the main code, the levels and the end sequence of each version, and combined them into a master version to work from. It soon became clear that the sheer amount of bugs would pose a significant challenge. Even getting it to a playable state without crashing proved a larger task than the team could handle. This project, being a labor of love and people having real lives, pulled the plug on the first attempt. Years passed while David struggled to find the right people, until he found Steve Day willing to make the loading screen Outrage has today. This proved to be a turning point at which David decided to enhance Outrage, rather than just bug fix it. Naturally, adding new things would make Outrage an Onslaught game as much as it was a Cosmos Designs game. Meanwhile, Cosmos Designs were becoming impatient, having no clue of the proportions of the task at hand to save Outrage, and they'd started to look for help elsewhere. Bernd has mentioned being in contact with an Italian group. I contacted Hokuto Force about this, but I couldn't get a solid confirmation. It was at this time that Sidney Arbau appeared on the stage. Sidney's involvement quickly satisfied Cosmos Designs not only to get bugs fixed, but also to enhance the game. I have only seen parts of the bug fix lists that document the bugs and their solutions. Version 1 of the fixed Outrage lists 17 bugs with the last entry reading, "and some more, sigh, many more." Throughout the process of fixing Outrage, there were many versions, each with extensive lists of bug fixes and gameplay improvements. The final version being 8.13, totaling well over 100 known fixes and changes. It is clear that, in David's opinion at least, Sidney got the project well off the start line and into a fantastic position. There were many fixes and small improvements, and a growing team of testers could now go to work, including Bieno Breitmeier, David, Bernd, Arnie Blümmel, and Protovision's Jakob Chen Vos. It is at this point, where the fixed Outrage had reached version 6, that Sidney got on with his real life again and handed off to Zach Thompson, also known as Karmic. In early 2020, when Zach took over, many of the bugs had already been fixed, but some nasty ones remained, one of them being raster flicker caused by the game using the busy waiting approach instead of interrupts to handle the raster code. This really required some recoding, which was another great step towards completion. Zach took care of preparing the game for NTSC as well as PAL, and consequently concentrated on changing the loader from the existing one to the new one, which is another difficult task, knowing that the previous loader was outdated and probably not very well documented. Zach's work getting Outrage towards completion was another vital pillar of Outrage's success. But in the end, it was Sidney's work that got the project moving in earnest. Let's meet Sidney Arbau. When you start Outrage and wait for the attract screen long enough, after a while the name Sidney Arbau comes up, who is credited for extra programming and bug fixing. This page was put in by the members of Onslaught, and it was decided that the one to be named here should be the one who put in the most work. Let's put a face to Sidney. Sidney Arbau is also known as Arcane, and is still a member of Onslaught. He has been a very active member of the C64 scene, and was also part of the group of people who worked on Outrage to get it finished. Many people that participated were or still are Onslaught members. I contacted Sidney and asked him about his experience. Before Sidney came on board in 2018, nobody had successfully managed to fix any of the bugs in the game, and people had been trying since 2010. Both Sidney and Thomas Mattis sent out to analyze the source code when they got on board. Building the executable from the source code was problematic, and attempts to fix the build process were never completed. Sidney decided to make his changes in the binaries he had received on Bernd's 7 original disks. Without any meaningful documentation, that is a monstrous task. If or to what extent Sidney made use of the previous efforts to organize the Outrage code is not entirely clear. For those who don't know, fixing a program from its binary code instead of its source code is a little like changing a meal after it's been cooked. You have to reverse engineer everything. As Sidney put it, that wasn't a fun job. By the way, the screenshots you are looking at show the before and afters of some of the bugs. Even when you use a disassembler, which effectively creates a source file from the binaries, you lose all the names and meanings of every label, variable, and routine. You're left with having to go through the code, spot the difference between code and data, mark registers you recognize, and slowly figure out the structure of the code. Sidney told me that he used a machine language monitor to do this, A monitor is a very basic tool for looking at memory and making changes. Making a change in the code that alters the number of bytes means you have to manually recalculate every jump and every branch below that point. Sydney also told me that some of the source code was available, at least for a few levels, and that the code was organized in a way that each level had to be assembled separately. And any change in the main code meant having to rebuild all of the levels. It sounds like the effort to make the code easy to work with was never really completed or used, making Sydney's job that much more difficult. It would be reasonable to assume that these difficulties were among the reasons why previous attempts to fix Outrage failed. It was a lot of work which, over time, had become too hard to do. The best time to finish the game had been back in 1993, but as we know, that work never started. The fact that Bernd himself wasn't able to finish the game after such a long time, with or without the help of his mentor Hannes, is another indicator of how tough that job was. During this time, David served as a central point of communication between Cosmos Designs, the testers, and the programmers. They identified bugs, determined what needed to be done, and the programmer would make it happen. Communication mainly went through fix lists, naming the bugs, their solutions, and the code required. Basically, these are all the functions of a collaboration and code versioning tool, just all done in the most primitive way. Keeping the entire project on track must have taken David a chunk of his time and effort as well. Sydney says he spent 12 months by himself fixing bugs and improving the game, while all the time leaving the game intact as much as possible. In the end, it was still to remain Bernd's game. After Sydney was done, he says that he was so fed up that he didn't touch a Commodore 64 for about a year and did nothing for the Onslaught group. If it hadn't been for Sydney's efforts, there wouldn't have been an Outrage at all. You would be forgiven to expect Sydney to be lauded copiously in interviews that Bernd granted to magazines and podcasts after the publication of Outrage. However, in all of the interviews I read and listened to, Sydney is mentioned only twice. Going by the way Outrage is presented currently, you wouldn't know about the crucial role of Sydney's share in the process, apart from his name being listed in the game. Naturally, I asked Bernd about this, and he immediately acknowledged the work Sydney, Zach, and David did and was happy to share the limelight. However, when I asked him about the difference between his original and the current version, his description regarding Sydney's work in particular was minor tweaks to level 1 and some bug fixes, some caused by the conversion of the original discs to PC. I want to emphasize here that among everyone I spoke with, nobody seemed to feel any resentment or ill will towards each other, and everyone seemed proud of their contribution to the end result. The goal of the entire project, and hereby everybody's personal goal, was to finish Bernd's Outrage, which they certainly did. Besides the bugs and the playability fixes by Sydney and Zach, much effort was put into the storyboard by David, the music by Roy Whitting, the box art and manual by Lobo and Trevor Story, the Petsky notes file by Cal Scewthorpe, the IDE 64 fix by Thomas Mattis, not to mention all the effort put in by Protovision and Cytronic. So many people were involved in bringing Outrage up to par and beyond. It really was an effort powered by people from the scene. Outrage turned out to be a wonderful example of the good things the C64 community can achieve when they believe in a common goal. It is this combined effort that should be in the limelight. If anything about Outrage should be celebrated, it's not the quality of the game itself, but the combined effort of the people involved. As impressive as Outrage's time to market has been, much of that time was spent in Bernd's drawer, waiting to be rediscovered. That said, 30 years is still a long time. Not quite as long as War On, which took 34 years to reach completion, but Outrage is in the leading pack nonetheless. Sadly for Bernd, that's not good enough to be entered in the Guinness Book of Records like Duke Nukem was with its 5,156 days, about 14 years, which seems to be on Bernd's wish list for Outrage. Although at the time of the making of this video, Beyond Good and Evil 2 has the record with 5,234 days. None of these facts are keeping Bernd from trying though. Let's wish him the best of luck. That brings us to how the game was received by reviewers. While Outrage came onto the market with some modern peripheral aspects like loading screen, updated music, and a cartridge version, it was still basically a 90s game. But it got some amazing review scores, even placing it above some of the modern classics. But while indispensable, do modern secondary functions of a game really make them worthy of the highest marks? And so, can a 90s game really compete with the likes of Metal Warrior Ultra or Sam's Journey? Having gone through all of them, the reviews of Outrage are mostly positive, with a few moderate ones as well. Some are ridiculously positive, but there are none that are outright negative. The raving reviews generally mention the same things: amazing graphics, music, gameplay, and replayability. The most commonly heard criticisms are bad color contrast, the pacing of the game, the run in the run and gun seems to falter, some gameplay oddities like falling off platforms, surprise kills by falling stones, enemies spawning at your feet, and the fact that it has only 5 levels. In short, a 90s game lacking modern-day sensibilities, which, after a 30-year time period, some say is a bit of a disappointment. But much of the effort was to remain true to Bernd's original, and if the level editor Bernd had mentioned had survived, this might have been a redeeming factor. With all of Outrage's reviews ranging between utterly amazing and just average, you're left wondering, is this game fantastic or just average? The problem with reviews is that some of them are made by people who don't produce a lot of reviews at all, making it impossible to gauge what their score means. Tom Wedlake's review of Outrage, for instance, is all 10s across the board. Against Tom's other reviews, which total exactly 0, all it means is that Tom really liked the game. But that's not a review, it's just one guy's opinion. Good marketing material, though. So when one magazine scores Sam's Journey's graphics with a 10, Zeta Wings with a 9, and Outrage's graphics with a 9, all that really matters is, do you agree with it? I do believe that some reviewers perhaps got caught up in the hype around Outrage a little bit when they scored the game, and that perhaps they meant to express their enthusiasm about the process of bringing Outrage back to life instead of the physical features of the game. But that's just conjecture on my part. Reviewers with a track record of reviews that have a known reference for their scores are the meaningful ones if you're inclined to listen to other people's opinions about what a game is like. Best to just go and see for yourself if you can. But overall, everybody seemed happy with Outrage as it was sold in 2020. Outrage is a 90s game that was published in 2020. By the efforts of many people, Outrage was transformed from what was a competition-winning but buggy mess into a finished game with all the modern bits and bobs. The hype created around it using some careful marketing has pushed it to the top of the review charts, perhaps rewarding the risk Protovision took and fulfilling one Austrian boy's dream. Some of the current community's well-known names have contributed to making Outrage a success, but mostly unmentioned until now has been the fantastic work by the unsung heroes of Outrage. First and foremost, Sidney Arbaugh for pulling off the monumental 12-month task of fixing the code from the binaries, David Simmons for finding and then coordinating between everyone involved, and Zach Thompson for adding the NTSC fix and the compression and loader code. Unsung heroes, no more.